Imagine discovering that the man responsible for hunting Soviet spies within the British Secret Service was himself the most dangerous Soviet spy in history. Kim Philby was not just an infiltrator in MI6. He was the head of the Soviet counterintelligence division, literally leading the hunt for himself. For nearly 3 decades, from 1934 to 1963, Philby held the highest positions in British intelligence, having unrestricted access to the West's most sensitive secrets during the Cold War. While his British colleagues trusted him to protect the country against communist infiltration, Philby systematically delivered every operation, every agent, and every strategic plan directly to Moscow. The magnitude of his betrayal is almost incomprehensible. He not only spied for the Soviets, but actively sabotaged Western operations from the inside out, shaping the very structure of the espionage war in favor of his true masters in the Kremlin. This is not just the story of a traitor. It is the revelation of how a single man managed to completely reverse the balance of power of the Cold War, transforming the heart of British intelligence into an extension of the Soviet KGB. Harold Adrian Russell Philby was born in 1912 in British India, the son of an explorer and colonial government official. His privileged education at Westminster School and later at Trinity College, Cambridge, should have prepared him for an exemplary career serving the British Empire. But it was precisely at Cambridge in 1934 that Philby was recruited by Soviet intelligence, not through coercion or blackmail, but by genuine ideological conviction. The 22-year-old had become a committed communist, believing that the Soviet system represented the future of humanity. His recruiter, Arnold Deutsch, an NKVD officer, predecessor of the KGB, immediately recognized Philby's extraordinary potential. Unlike other spies who operated on the fringes of power, Philby was cultivated to infiltrate the very heart of the British establishment. For 6 years, from 1934 to 1940, Philby lived a meticulously constructed double life. Publicly, he presented himself as a conservative journalist, even covering the Spanish Civil War from the Francoist side to establish anti-communist credentials. Privately, he received intensive training in espionage techniques, clandestine communication, and psychological manipulation. When World War II broke out, Philby was perfectly positioned for his true mission, to infiltrate the British Secret Service. In 1940, Kim Philby achieved something that seemed impossible. He was recruited by MI6, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, despite having no formal experience in espionage. His entry was facilitated by connections from the British educational elite, and his reputation as a reliable journalist with anti-communist credentials established during the coverage of the Spanish Civil War. Philby began in Section D, responsible for sabotage and special operations, but his rise was meteoric. His superiors were impressed by his keen intelligence, exceptional analytical ability, and, ironically, his apparent dedication to the British cause. In 1944, just 4 years after joining the service, Philby was promoted to head of Section 9, the division specifically created to combat Soviet espionage. The irony was devastating. The man tasked with protecting Britain against Soviet spies was the most well-placed Soviet spy in history. In this position, Philby had access to all files on anti-Soviet operations, lists of Western agents operating in the Soviet Union, intelligence operation plans, and intercepted communications between Allied agencies. Every document that crossed his desk was photographed and transmitted to Moscow through a sophisticated communication network that included shortwave radios, secret meeting points, and human couriers. The KGB not only received British intelligence, it was literally directing British counterintelligence operations through its infiltrated agent. Philby's position as head of Soviet counterintelligence gave him almost godlike power over the fate of Western agents. In 1945, a case shockingly demonstrated the lethal extent of his influence. Konstantin Volkov, an NKVD officer based in Istanbul, decided to defect to the West, offering devastating information in exchange for asylum. Volkov promised to reveal the names of 3 high-level Soviet agents operating within the British government, including a head of counterintelligence department, who could only be Philby himself. When Volkov's offer reached MI6 in London, it was naturally forwarded to Philby, as the head of the section responsible for dealing with Soviet defectors. Philby immediately recognized the mortal danger that Volkov represented to his operation. In a cold demonstration of loyalty to the Soviets, Philby alerted his handlers in Moscow about Volkov's intention to defect. When an MI6 team finally arrived in Istanbul to meet Volkov, they discovered that he had disappeared. In reality, he had been kidnapped by the KGB and executed. Philby not only saved his own operation, he deliberately sent a man to his death to protect his position. This pattern would repeat dozens of times. Whenever Western agents were sent on missions to the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, Philby ensured that the KGB was waiting for them. Philby's power within MI6 grew even further when he orchestrated the removal of his own superior, Felix Kaugyl, in a brilliantly executed internal political maneuver. Kaugyl was seen as outdated and inefficient by the upper echelons of MI6, and Philby exploited these perceptions to systematically undermine his boss's authority. Through a subtle campaign of criticisms and constructive suggestions to superiors, Philby managed to have Kaugyl transferred to a less influential position. With Kaugyl out of the way, Philby took full control of Soviet counterintelligence operations. He would later admit, "It was a very dirty story, but after all, our work involves getting our hands dirty from time to time." The irony of these words is haunting. Philby was literally describing how he betrayed his own country to advance Soviet interests. In his new position of absolute power, Philby completely restructured British anti-Soviet operations. He redirected resources to investigations he knew would be fruitless, protected Soviet agents who were under suspicion, and ensured that the most sensitive operations were sabotaged before they even began. Declassified documents reveal that during Philby's peak influence, between 1944 and 1951, virtually all Western intelligence operations against the Soviet Union failed. What the British interpreted as exceptional efficiency of Soviet counterintelligence was, in reality, the direct result of having the very head of British counterintelligence working for Moscow. The espionage network that Philby commanded extended far beyond his own activities. He was part of what became known as the Cambridge Ring, a group of 5 Soviet spies recruited at the University of Cambridge during the 1930s. In addition to Philby, the group included Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. Each had infiltrated different aspects of the British establishment: Maclean in the Foreign Office, Blunt in MI5, Internal Intelligence, Cairncross in the Government Code and Cipher School, precursor to GCHQ, and Burgess in various government positions. Philby, as the most well-placed member of the group, often coordinated their activities and protected the other members when suspicions arose. The amount of information this ring was able to provide to the Soviets was staggering. NATO military plans, Allied communication codes, Western diplomatic strategies, nuclear weapons development, and complete lists of Western agents operating in the Soviet bloc. Conservative estimates suggest that the Cambridge Ring was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Western agents and the failure of thousands of intelligence operations during the Cold War. Philby was not just a spy, he was the conductor of an orchestra of betrayal that fundamentally redefined the balance of power between East and West. KGB documents released after the collapse of the Soviet Union revealed that Moscow considered Philby and his ring as their most valuable assets, more important even than many of their own intelligence officers. Philby's mastery of psychological manipulation was perhaps his most dangerous talent. MI6 colleagues described him as charismatic, trustworthy, and patriotic, exactly the qualities that made his betrayal so devastating. James Jesus Angleton, head of CIA counterintelligence and a close friend of Philby, would later admit that he considered Philby one of the most intelligent men I have ever met, and that he trusted him completely. This trust allowed Philby to have access not only to British secrets, but also to highly classified American intelligence shared among allies. During coordination meetings between MI6 and the CIA, Philby often took detailed notes that were later transmitted to Moscow. He went so far as to suggest joint operations that he knew would fail, wasting Western resources while providing the Soviets with valuable information about American capabilities and intentions. His manipulation technique was subtle, but devastatingly effective. He never seemed eager for information, never asked suspicious questions, and always demonstrated the appropriate level of concern for security. When suspicions about leaks arose, Philby was often consulted to help identify the source, allowing him to divert investigations from himself and, when necessary, sacrifice minor agents to protect his position. Former colleagues later described the feeling of having been hypnotized by Philby, so convincing was his persona as a dedicated and patriotic intelligence officer. The year 1951 marked the beginning of the end for Philby, although he managed to maintain his position for another 12 years through a combination of audacity, manipulation, and sheer luck. Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, two of his colleagues from the Cambridge Ring, fled to Moscow when investigations began to dangerously close in on them. Their sudden defections inevitably raised questions about other possible infiltrators in the British government. Philby, as a known friend of Burgess and colleague of MacLean, naturally fell under suspicion. But instead of panicking, Philby demonstrated extraordinary composure. When called in for interrogation, he not only denied any involvement with Soviet espionage, but actively assisted in the investigations into the defectors, providing insights into their personalities and possible motivations. His performance was so convincing that many investigators left the interrogations more convinced of his innocence than before. In 1955, facing growing public pressure, Philby made an audacious decision that demonstrated his supreme confidence in his manipulation skills. He held a press conference to publicly deny the accusations. In front of skeptical journalists, Philby categorically declared, "I have never been a communist," and denied being the infamous third man sought by authorities. His performance was so convincing that the British public largely accepted his innocence, and he was officially cleared of suspicions. During the 8 years between his public exoneration in 1955 and his final escape in 1963, Philby continued operating as a Soviet spy, albeit in a reduced capacity. Officially removed from MI6, he worked as a correspondent for the Observer newspaper in the Middle East, a position that gave him continued access to valuable information about regional politics and Western intelligence operations. Based in Beirut, Philby maintained contact with British and American intelligence officers who still considered him a trustworthy colleague, even if retired. He continued transmitting information to Moscow, including details about CIA operations in the Middle East and Western plans for the region during a crucial period that included the Suez Crisis and various Western-backed coup attempts. But suspicions never completely disappeared. In 1962, new evidence emerged when Anatoly Golitsyn, a KGB defector, provided information that unequivocally pointed to Philby as a long-time Soviet agent. This time, the evidence was irrefutable. Nicholas Elliott, an old friend and MI6 colleague, was sent to Beirut to confront Philby with the evidence. In a conversation that lasted several hours, Elliott presented detailed evidence of Philby's betrayal, hoping for a confession that could be used to minimize political damage. Philby, realizing that his time had finally run out, made a partial confession, admitting to working for the Soviets, but minimizing the scope and duration of his activities. On January 23, 1963, Kim Philby disappeared from Beirut. Officially, he had gone out for dinner and simply never returned. In reality, he had boarded a Soviet freighter that took him across the Black Sea to Odessa and from there to Moscow. His escape was the culmination of nearly 3 decades of the most successful espionage operation in modern history. When Philby arrived in Moscow, he was received as a hero by the Soviets. He was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, one of the highest Soviet military decorations, and a generous pension that allowed him to live comfortably until his death in 1988. But Philby's true prize was not Soviet honors. It was the knowledge that he had fundamentally altered the course of the Cold War. Later analyses revealed that the information provided by Philby allowed the Soviets to neutralize hundreds of Western operations, save dozens of their own agents, and develop effective countermeasures against Western technologies and strategies. Most devastatingly, his betrayal forced Western intelligence services to question every operation, every source, and every analysis of the past 20 years. The resulting paranoia, known as the Philby syndrome, partially paralyzed Western intelligence operations for decades, with officers constantly questioning whether their colleagues could be double agents. Kim Philby's legacy transcends his individual betrayal. He demonstrated how a single individual, strategically positioned and skillfully manipulative, can fundamentally alter the global balance of power. His story forced a complete reassessment of security procedures in intelligence services worldwide, leading to the development of multiple verification systems, information compartmentalization, and continuous psychological monitoring of intelligence officers. But perhaps Philby's most profound impact was psychological. He forever shattered the innocence of Western intelligence services, introducing a level of suspicion and paranoia that persists to this day. James Angleton, the CIA officer who trusted Philby the most, never fully recovered from the betrayal, developing an obsession with mole hunts that harmed CIA operations for years. The Philby syndrome became a technical term used to describe the organizational paralysis that results from excessive suspicion of internal infiltration. Today, more than 60 years after his defection, Kim Philby remains the standard by which all other espionage cases are measured. His story serves as a grim reminder that in the espionage war, the most dangerous enemy may be the one who sits beside you in the meeting room, who knows your most intimate secrets, and whom you consider your most trusted friend. As Philby once observed with characteristic irony, to betray, you first have to belong, and no one in history belonged so completely to the establishment they betrayed as Harold Adrian Russell Philby, the spy who became the boss.